Well, it's impossible for someone like me, brown person in Britain, not to be brought into the topic of race. It's I live the topic of race. But I came to Britain when I was about 6, and the Britain I grew up in was very different from the Britain it is today. In those days, racism was vicious, visceral in a way that's barely imaginable now. Racist attacks were daily. It's hard to think of a time I didn't come back from school having been in a fight. Racism drew me into politics. I got involved in a whole host of campaigns about deportations, about racist attacks, about racism in the workplace, and so on. But if it was racism that drew me into politics, it was politics that made me see beyond racism, to see that there were broader issues of social justice, and that thinking about social justice simply in terms of my experiences was insufficient. I came to read people like Marx and Mill, Baldwin and Arendt, who drew me into an entirely different universe. I began to see the world in a different way. And it was at that time the left was still what one might call the Universalist left. There were still Universalist strands to the idea that what we were fighting for was not simply shaped by one's identity, but was about creating coalitions and movements that went across identities, and that it is only in transforming everybody's lives that one gets to transform one's own life. But within about this, we're talking about here about the early 1980s. But within about a decade, much of that had changed. That the left became much more rooted in identitarian notions. The big issue for me was the Salman Rushdie campaign in 1988, 1989, where a lot of my friends who'd been on the left suddenly became opponents of Rushdie, thought the satanic verses should be censored, supported the burning of the book. And it got me to thinking about what had happened, why that was the case, why the left has changed so much. And it got me thinking about identitarian politics, and that's what I've been thinking about and arguing against for the best part of 30 years.
Yeah. So one thing that's interesting about this is I'm American, and you grew up in Manchester and have lived in London for a very long time. And there are striking similarities between how the conversation has evolved in America and in Britain. We've seen the same move from a universalist left, from a left in America that could really claim to live by Martin Luther King's, universalist message of we are all brothers. In Christ there is neither Greek nor Jew, black nor white. He would say things like that, to a left that is much more focused on, as you call it, stay in your lane arguments, which I think is a great summary of the ethos of the left, right? If you're black, stay in your black lane. If you're white, stay in your white lane. If you're Mexican, stay, is that we all have these racial lanes and roles to play and beliefs and politics that come sort of as a package deal with the race or ethnicity that you're born into. And that's often called identity politics. There are also differences, though, between America and the UK. One, which is that in America we had, slavery within our own borders, and often that historical episode is at the center of some of our deepest controversies. And the other difference is that we've long been a nation of immigrants, a nation with massive immigration in the mid-19th century. And so I guess the pattern of immigration and backlash and more immigration and backlash is very old in America, but I think it's newer in the UK. I'm curious how you view the differences between America and the UK when it comes to the issue of racial identity.
I think one of the problems we have is that because of the economic, social, cultural heft of America, what happens in America tends to shape what happens elsewhere. So attitudes about race, arguments about race in America are simply taken on and applied to other countries where they're less applicable. One of the reasons that the book concentrates on America is precisely that because the arguments about race in America are so influential to the rest of the world that it's important to challenge it in its own terms, to unpick them, and therefore to show why they're not so applicable, not just in the rest of the world, but to America itself. Mm-hmm. I think that the identitarian strain is probably much stronger in America than it is elsewhere. I mean, mm-hmm. you can see it elsewhere, but it is probably much stronger in America. And to me, to explain the shift to an identitarian turn, you have to understand two things. Firstly, that anti-racist movements, anti-colonial movements have always had an identitarian aspect to them. There's always been a tension within anti-racist movements between identitarian and universalist perspectives. Mm-hmm. So, you go back to the 19th century and you have the Back to Africa movements in America. Mm-hmm. And then you have Marcus Garvey in the early 20th century, negritude, Pan-Africanism, and so on. Mm-hmm. So those have always been there. But not till relatively recently have they become the dominant force within anti-racist discourse. And the reason they've become the dominant force is, I think, to do with the social pessimism that has developed over the last half century. To adopt a universalist perspective, to think that you can build coalitions across the fissures of race and class and ethnicity and so on, to think that you can radically transform society requires a certain degree of optimism, social optimism. And much of that has ebbed over the last half century. So more and more people cling on to what they have. They cling on to their particular identities, the boxes into which we've been put, and see the world more and more through those identities, through those boxes. So I think it's important to locate where we are. It's not as if we've suddenly become all identitarians. It's always been there, mm-hmm. but that the wider shifts, the wider economic, political, social shifts, and in particular the way that the labour movement has lost influence, has lost force over the past half century, it's played an important part in what we're seeing now.
So let's rewind. A lot of your book deals with the history of the idea of race. Mm-hmm. This idea of humanity being separated into 5 or 6 distinct groups. That concept has not been around forever. It has an origin story like any other idea does. And so I'm curious, in your view, when did the idea of race begin, and how did it evolve from its first state into what it is today? That's obviously a very big question.
I make the argument that, and lots of people have made this argument, of course, that race is a product of modernity. It's not that in the pre-modern world there wasn't bigotry, or there wasn't a sense, a belief that other groups may have been subhuman. There wasn't a lack of huge intolerance against other groups. Clearly there was. But what there wasn't was a sense that humans were equal, and there was a single universal sense of humanity. That was what developed largely in the 18th century. We think about the Enlightenment and Enlightenment notions of equality and universalism. And against the background of societies that broadly accept the idea of equality, of universality, the notion of racism, the notion of inequality, racial inequality, becomes something very different. What you have from the late 18th century onwards is our societies that are rooted in the idea that all humans are equal, all men are equal, as the American Declaration of Independence broadly says, or the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, which broadly says much the same. So the idea of equality becomes a defining feature of post-Enlightenment societies, Western societies. But that abstract belief in equality is set against the practice of inequality, the social practice of inequality, of enslavement, of the refusal to grant rights to women, to minorities, to working class, and so on. And race develops in the modern world out of that contradiction, as a way of almost of making sense of that contradiction. That race becomes a way of saying certain people are by nature unequal, and therefore not deserving or not worthy of equality. And that became an explanation for slavery, for instance. It was black people, the ancestors of today's African Americans, weren't enslaved because they were black. Slavery has existed well before modernity, and both blacks and whites were enslaved in those days. So the ancestors of today's African Americans weren't enslaved because they were black, but they came to be deemed as racially distinct and racially inferior as black people as a way of justifying their enslavement. So race becomes a means of explaining and justifying the continuation of inequalities in societies that had proclaimed their fidelity to equality. And what's important to recognize is how different, say, 19th century views of race were than contemporary views of race. We think of race largely in terms of skin color or continent of origin, black, white, Asian, and so on. Whereas for 19th century thinkers, race was primarily a description of social inequalities. So yes, black people, Asians, Chinese, Indians, and so on, were seen as inferior, but so was the working class. I mean, it may be difficult to comprehend now, but 19th century thinkers saw factory workers and farmhands as racially distinct from themselves, as many see white and black as racially distinct. And their inability to be any more than factory workers or farmhands was attributed to the fact that they were racially inferior.
Yeah. So there's a few things there. One is the difference between an ethnic group and a race. As you point out in the book, at that time, ethnic groups often viewed themselves and talked about themselves as distinct races. People that would be considered the same race today, like the Irish and the British, or the Normans and, the Gauls, people that would all be described today are seen as white, at the time had, bitter hostility, rivalries, and conceptions of themselves as different races. On the other hand, I do feel that there is a difference between ethnic differences and racial differences, which is that the more that people look very different at a glance, the easier it is for those hostilities to persist over very long periods of time, and the harder it is for groups to truly meld into one. So, for example, the Enlightenment thinkers, some of the Enlightenment thinkers that I admire, and I'm sure you do too, like Frederick Douglass, one of the major things they were wrong about in the case of Douglass is that they thought by now there would be no such thing as black people and white people, that we would have intermarried and intermingled to such a point where we would all kind of look like a fairly undifferentiated mass. Yet the patterns of people looking different and you know, based on where their ancestors are from, has persisted to a degree that they didn't predict, right? And it seems to me, you know, when we talk about how ethnic groups, in the American case, which I know the most about, such as Irish Americans, Italian Americans, Polish Americans, etc., by now, white Americans my age, most of them don't care where their ancestors are from. They're just vaguely European. I don't really care. And the white identity has subsumed all of these formerly super important differences. Whereas the difference between white and black as a socially important category has remained. And it seems to me the key difference, it's not that, for instance, the bitterness between, you know, the Irish and British were any less real. They're, you know, huge. But it's that when people look the same, or not the same, but when people look rather similar, it's easier for them to blend over the course of hundreds of years, in a way that it just is harder when there are actual, you know, color differences. Does that seem like a fair analysis to you?
There are a number of points here. The first is that if you go back to the 19th century, people saw the Irish or the working class as physically distinct.
Sure.
You know, in a way we would find it absurd today. That was the case. Mm-hmm. So it's not purely the question of looking different that's at issue here, but it is true that the fact that black people are easily distinguishable from whites plays an important part in this. One of the reasons that slavery was racialized, for instance, at the end of, say, the 17th century, early 18th century, was that there were continual struggles against both slavery and indentured servitude, which is what poor whites faced in America in those days. That blacks and whites used to get together and challenge their enslavement or servitude, and that it became easier. It was a lot easier to distinguish, say, a runaway slave if that slave was black than if that slave was white. And so, partly to break up that coalition between blacks and whites, slavery became increasingly racialized. You can see that in America at the end of the 19th century too, when you had, in the post-Reconstruction world, you had the fusion movements between poor whites and blacks, which challenged the elite, particularly in the South, in North and South Carolina, in Virginia, and so on, challenged them by presenting a broader, more equal notion of what kind of society they want to live in. They challenged particularly the Democrats, who were the elites and the pro-slavery party in the South. And in order to break up that coalition again, quite deliberately, in order to break up that coalition between whites and blacks, Jim Crow was introduced in a most ferocious way to allow for certain types of privileges for whites and to segregate blacks. And so you can see how racism becomes a means of breaking up cross-racial coalitions, class coalitions against the elites. The idea of going back to your argument about skin color, it's only in the early 20th century that whiteness, as we understand it, and blackness, as we understand it, became consolidated. That what you call ethnic groups, the Irish, the Slavs, and so on, became seen as whites, and that the major division was purely between black and white. And there were two reasons for that. One was the expansion of democracy within Western nations, so that the working class, which had largely been excluded from the democratic process, were now brought in, given the vote, brought into the democratic process. And it became much more difficult to talk about the working class as racially inferior when they're part of the democratic process. Mm-hmm. And the second reason was the expansion of imperialism, the new imperialism, the scramble for Africa from the 1880s onwards. So that the scramble for Africa divided up Africa among the European nations. America seized parts of the Pacific, and so on. And that new imperialism redrew what Du Bois calls the colour line, and made race much more what, as we see it now, as a issue of race, issue of skin colour, of a black and white issue, than it had been previously.